Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Joanna Connors, and it is my honor and privilege today to introduce our event, a panel conversation about turning the tide on sexual violence against women. Dan already plugged my book, so I won't do it again, but maybe next fall we'll talk about that. But I will say that it's a personal story, and it's about my own journey as a survivor of rape, and a lot of what we'll be talking about here today is connected to those issues. So I'm guessing there are probably about 100 women here in the audience today, maybe more. What that means is that at least 15 of us here have experienced some form of sexual violence, or will in the future. Allow me just a few more numbers to paint the picture. In only 27% of cases is the assailant a stranger. That means nearly 3/4 of the time the assault is committed by somebody the victim knows, and even worse, the victim trusts. As many of you know, this is not the kind of trauma that you just get over. It lives with you. And when they tell their stories, victims of sexual violence will tell you that the trauma never leaves them. It's present not just in memories, but in a lifetime of being prone to depression and predisposed to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. Here in Ohio, as we know, the issue has become even more prevalent. We've had Steubenville, Cleveland's heroic survivors, Gina DeJesus, Amanda Berry, and Michelle Knight, and the tragic victims on Imperial Avenue. But perhaps our greatest sign of hope is newly ignited public interest in testing the backlog of rape kits, those evidence samples collected by law enforcement and physicians. No one has done more to draw attention to that issue than our moderator today. Rachel Dissell is a colleague of mine at the Plain Dealer. She's an award-winning reporter, and her dedication to telling the stories that need to be told is legendary. I've been proud to work alongside her for these many years. Rachel, I hand the event over to you.
Thank you. I know I don't look old enough to be legendary yet. I'm so happy to be here with this panel, and I think it's really important that we're having this conversation this week that is 5 years, since the tragedy on Imperial Avenue. And it's a great time to talk about relevant topics in terms of how far we've come in terms of addressing sexual violence in our community, and what we still have to do, and what we need everybody's help in this audience and in this city and in this county and in this state to accomplish. So here with us today, we have a great panel. Everybody's very knowledgeable about this topic. Here next to me is Representative Nickie Antonio, who represents Ohio's 14th District. 13th? Oh, sorry. 13th. I got the wrong information. Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority Chief, as I call him, Andy Gonzalez, and Katie Hanna, who's the Executive Director of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Sondra Miller, President and CEO of the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. So first what we're going to do is we're going to have our conversation with the panelists with some questions, and then about halfway through this we'll go to your questions, and I hope you guys in the audience are thinking of some really good questions to address. So I'm going to start with Representative Antonio. There's been a number of bills introduced in the past few years that address the topic of sexual assault. Some address prevention funding, others address the statute of limitations in sexual assault cases, rape and sexual battery cases, which is 20 years. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that those bills that have passed have shown us, and what we still need to accomplish?
So probably the most successful bill of recent times has been to actually fund rape crisis centers. So we actually got a line item into the budget. It's important, it was actually precedent setting, because what it means is that every time we revisit the budget, that line will be there, and the discussion should be, is that enough for the services that we're providing? Do we need to increase that amount? But it starts with the premise that we do indeed support and fund rape crisis center services in the state of Ohio. So that was a precedent-setting legislation that we are very happy that's there. The other bills, you mentioned the fact that we have a bill in the Senate right now. There's a couple of bills that deal with statute of limitations. And I think in recent events that we've seen where the rape kits are being processed, but what we're finding out is that there's a track of folks who have been victimizing women that go way back, sometimes beyond the statute of limitations, which is 20 years. And so that is, I think, a critical piece of legislation that we need to address and move forward. We've also introduced a Bill of Rights for sexual assault survivors. And that's important because there are critical steps in one's survival that should be taken for granted, but they are not. So there's a threshold of respect, of providing comprehensive information, and a number of other elements that really would serve survivors well.
And Katie, Representative Antonio mentioned that line item for funding, but has funding started to kind of catch up with what we need to support survivors in the state of Ohio? I mean, I was shocked when that happened that it was the first time that there had ever been money dedicated statewide to support programs that support survivors.
Yeah, I think we've made significant steps forward in investing in our communities to make sure that survivors get the support that they need. We still have a long way to go. We have states next door that get $6 million a year addressing this issue. And so really investing in prevention and making sure that survivors, regardless of what county you live in, that you get the services that you need to heal. Certainly in counties in Cuyahoga County, as we see sexual violence on the national radar in our state over the last 2 years, we have more and more survivors coming forward. And that's a really positive thing because we know that people are paying attention. They're starting to talk about this issue. But we need to make sure that we have those sustained funding mechanisms in place to make sure that this is an issue that we address for the 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys that will experience sexual abuse before they turn 18.
And it seems like there's a couple different realms that we deal with here. There's the law enforcement piece, and we'll get to that in a little bit. There's the funding and the policy piece. But we've also been talking a lot more about prevention in recent years. And Sondra, I know that along with supporting survivors, which is a big part of what Cleveland Rape Crisis does, the mission of prevention seems to have gotten to be a lot more important. Can you talk about that? I know you've told me that you have a lot more requests now for people to come out and give programs to help raise awareness and talk about the prevention piece with youth and other folks.
Yeah, promoting prevention is one of the core ideals that Cleveland Rape Crisis Center was founded on, but it's often the hardest part of our work to find funding for. And that's why the state line item this year, that meant about a $35,000 grant to Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. We allocated that to prevention because it's so important to us. But what we've seen as prevention programs have evolved over time is that they used to be more about teaching women not to walk alone in a parking lot, don't drink too much, walk in groups, and safety precautions. I think we're always in favor of doing everything you can to keep yourself safe. But what we know is that keeping women taking these steps is not going to stop rape. If we want to stop rape, we have to stop the people who are committing the crimes. And so our prevention programs have evolved over time to focus more on engaging men and young boys in talking about healthy masculinity and what it's like to live in today's world where they're bombarded with violent messages through the media, through video games, and even involve the programs one step further where we take a group of teenagers in a classroom and we say, we're not going to talk to you as if half of you are potential victims and half of you are potential perpetrators. We're talking to all of you as bystanders, and at some point in your life, all of you are going to see and hear things that may not be safe, and what do you do with that? And what our data shows us is that when you talk to those teenagers before they are in our program, they know what rape is. They know it's bad. We don't have to teach them those things, but they don't know what to do about it if they see something unsafe. And so our programs have evolved to focus more on skill building and changing attitudes to ultimately prevent sexual violence from happening.
And I think that phrase is one that people are hearing more of, bystander intervention. Can you just talk a little bit about what that is for people that might not know?
So a bystander is someone in the room who is neither a victim, neither a perpetrator, neither a potential victim, neither a potential perpetrator, but a third party who may be in the community, in the room, in the dorm room, on the college campus, who may see or hear things. It could be something, there are 2 students who use the word rape as a joke. Someone overhears that. If you don't stand up and say, hey, that's not okay, it pretty much sends the message to keep doing that this is funny. So a bystander, your role is really to stand up when people are saying and doing things that can be really harmful to others.
So it's not always just maybe stopping a crime that might be in progress. It's constantly, being aware of what's being said and then asserting what the right thing to do is instead of just kind of letting it go, letting it roll off your shoulders.
Changing cultural norms as well as disrupting harmful behavior.
Okay. Chief Gonzalez, I know that you've been doing this for quite a while. And in your experience, can you talk a little bit about what's changed the most in recent years in terms of how police respond to sexual assault cases, from the very beginning to someone actually responding to a call, but also in general, what we've learned that's changed the way that police handle the cases?
Sure, I can do that, but first got to file a complaint because you take the only guy in the panel, you put him right smack dab in the middle. So, be nice to me.
I'll get to that complaint later.
Really is an honor to be sitting here with these ladies here. First of all, let me admit to everyone here, cops, law enforcement, we don't always get it right. We try to do the best that we can with the information and the knowledge and sometimes the culture that we're in, but we really don't get it right all the time. Now, there's 2 things you can do when you don't get it right. One is keep on banging your head up against the brick wall and you know what happens after that. Or then you can address those things that you don't get right and try to put other measures or try to put policies or practices in place to get it right. One of the things that we've identified in the shortcomings and our challenges is that we, in the past, have failed to recognize the full impact of a sexual assault on the person that we're talking to. Number one, we have this tendency, I want to say had, I mean some of us are still practicing it, but we have this tendency to just isolate the individual and just focus on that person without taking into consideration the impact to that person's extended family, to their relatives, to their neighbors, and really to the community as a whole. So what we were doing is treating this incident and applying a silo effect and saying that this is isolated to this one individual. That was a mistake. The second thing that we recognize from those shortcomings is that we unfortunately had a tendency to attack the victim through their credibility. And probably that's been the most damaging part of an investigation when an officer walks into an environment, identifies an individual who's been gone through this violent experience, and now this individual has to confront this police or talk to this police officer, and their credibility is being questioned. Well, if anybody questions your credibility, guess what you're going to do? You're going to shut down and you're going to look for other resources. The sad part of that is that unfortunately, because of the way that officers have been trained in the past, we do have to get to, at some point, we've got to get to the truth. We've got to try to establish the facts. And what that's done is created a big divide between the victim and the officers. And that divide has caused mistrust. So we as police chiefs, police executives, people in authority, we have to really shift now how we address, how we talk to our members, how we talk to our officers in approaching a victim of a sexual assault. And some of the things that we're now teaching our guys and pushing is, number one, try to be empathetic. Not necessarily put yourself in their shoes, because there's no way that we could possibly do that. But try to be understanding that what this individual has gone through is severe. It's serious. It may not be serious to you, but to that individual, it's the worst thing in the world. The other thing we do with our officers is we remind our officers that in some ways we represent the very issue of why they're been victimized. Sometimes it's about control. Sometimes it's about power. Sometimes it's about just being plain old vulnerable. And think about when you're encountering a police officer, right? Police officer has control. Police officer has to mandate and shift. So in some ways, when we explain to the officer that the victim is going through what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, that those effects, once we recognize what these are, we can now start dealing through that in a different way. And then finally, the last thing that we try to impress on our officers is it still remains important for us to get to the truth, but not at the expense of attacking the victim. Not at the expense of going back and saying, I don't believe you. Those are horrible words that any police officer and any investigator can say to a victim of a crime, I don't believe you. Instead, at least what the chiefs in our county are trying to do is really impress on focusing on the facts, getting the information as the individual is relating it to you, and making a report. Making a report so that we give enough ammunition, or should I say, enough information so that a trained investigator can now follow up with that. And now, alongside an advocate, alongside the prosecutor, alongside whatever comes next, we can really competently meet the needs of the individual and interview them to get down to what we really need to, which is the facts.
And that's a good point. I remember several years back when we started looking at, there's lots of law enforcement jurisdictions in this county, not just one or two. And I remember, calling the different police departments and realizing that many of them didn't even have a policy on how officers should investigate a sexual assault. And one person in particular, no names, I remember telling me, well, yeah, we have a policy on what we do with a stolen bicycle report, but we don't get enough sexual assaults to have a policy on that. And afterward, I know that there was a lot of hard work within the county to at least get a model policy and get many of the cities to adopt that. Can you think of some other things that law enforcement in the county maybe still needs to work on cooperatively to make sure that no matter where a person goes, what hospital, what police department that they go in to make a report at, that they're treated the same way and that their report's taken seriously and that it's followed up on?
One of the big challenges in law enforcement is exchanging information from one agency to another. And we've made great strides in improving the flow of information. I really got to give the FBI credit on this. Steve Anthony, he's really stepped up, put his FBI task force in place, and made that available to all police departments, all law enforcement agencies throughout Cuyahoga County, so that if there's a need to exchange information through this task force, they can exchange that information, cross interjurisdictional line, not worry about boundaries, and identify and resolve the issues. I also have to give some credit to Tim McGinty, our county prosecutor, because he, in many ways, has stepped up and done this regional collaboration. It may not be perfect, but it's certainly better than what it was, say 5 or 6 years ago. So the big issue for law enforcement is exchanging information. I think recently the big example of that is the knucklehead that we recently arrested that was doing stuff in Lakewood and in Cleveland. Now, had it not been for that inter-jurisdictional exchange of information, who knows what could have happened or how long, how much more of a delay would have been. But because, Lakewood was talking with Cleveland, Cleveland was talking with the FBI, the FBI was talking with the prosecutors, and everybody was involved. We were, unfortunately, the incident happened. We couldn't prevent it, but we were able to work through all the details and get that, as I say, that knucklehead in custody. So,
thanks. Sondra, one thing that's kind of always baffled me is that when I talk to people at Cleveland Rape Crisis Center about what they do and what a need there is for services and how great it is, it always seems like the resources being put towards advocacy and programming are so small. I know that there's been some new resources recently, but it always seems so small compared to the need. Do you know why that is, kind of in a big, a big kind of policy society answer, or You know, why don't people contribute more? I mean, I know a lot of people personally contribute, but as a whole.
Yeah, let's be real, this is not an easy topic to talk about. I mean, the City Club has been here for 102 years, and now we have a panel talking about this. This is a little bit of a milestone here. But when you break it down and you talk about living room conversations, if I ask the people in this room how many of you have talked about this in your living room, I'm guessing not very many hands would go up. A couple. So we buy into these ideas, and what the media, what movies, and what we read in the newspaper, what we see on TV, what those stories are, we think that represents what happens in terms of sexual violence. I will tell you that what we see every day walking through our doors, very different picture. 1 in 5 women in Ohio will experience rape in her lifetime. 1 in 71 men in Ohio will experience rape. Very few of them will ever make it to the point of filing a police report. Some of them will tell a family member or a friend, and probably their story is more likely to be discounted than it is to be believed and supported. So what happens is survivors stay silent about what has happened and often find their own ways to cope with the trauma that they've experienced, which means survivors are more likely to experience depression, 13 times more likely to use alcohol, 26 times more likely to experience drugs, many times more likely to contemplate suicide. And it's only when survivors get to that very desperate point, it's often, I should say, when they get to that very desperate point that they raise their hand and say, I need help. And we need resources to help people right in the very beginning of that healing process. But talking about it is the very first step in that process. The next step then to your question, Rachel, is why isn't leading to funding is, I often hear resources are limited. They're limited everywhere. We have to make this a priority. And ultimately, I believe we will save our local, state, and federal governments money by investing in these services.
And that's the priority part of it, I think, is what's most important to recognize, especially when we look at the small amount of funds, as you mentioned, $35,000 for something sounds like a small amount of money when we're thinking about doing something in the whole county. There are counties we know in the state of Ohio that don't have any services available because the resources aren't there. But I think part of it, to your question, also goes back to something that the chief was talking about, which is these perceptions of it's a hard thing to talk about to begin with, but then the perceptions of whether or not women, because the majority of these cases are women, are telling the truth. Or do they have some other agenda at bringing something like this forward when they file a complaint, go to the police? I found this out the hard way in terms of having those discussions about whether women are believed or not when we talked about the bill for a survivor who becomes pregnant as a result of rape having sole custody. And when I started talking to legislators, I was stunned at their response, which was, well, women lie about this. I did not expect to have that be the response that someone was going to give to me as we were talking about this issue. And so long before we can get to that reasonable amount of resources coming in, changing the hearts and minds of people, the perceptions, talking about it, really talking about it in forums such as this, and raising the awareness, I think, are going to make all the difference.
I think one of the hard realities that we have to confront and talk about is that we know perpetrators. Most rapes that are committed are committed by somebody known to the victim. And that's a really hard conversation to have. I think the hope that we have and what's good is that we know that most men will never commit acts of sexual violence. And so we talk about bystander intervention. It's about really equipping teens and youth and adults to have those skills to intervene so that we do talk about these issues, and that most importantly, when a survivor does come forward, that we believe them and we support them through that process.
And one thing that I found interesting as we've reported on the rape kit testing is that you're right. Most people are attacked by someone they know, but in looking at the data, some of those people who attacked folks they knew also went on to attack people they didn't know. So you cannot silo these cases and expect that that won't be me or that won't be someone I know. And staying with the issue of sexual assault kit testing, Representative Antonio, can you talk a little bit about how that issue, since it's bubbled up and become one that people almost can't ignore sometimes, if it had anything to do with it, thank you. I won't let them ignore it. But has that helped policymakers at all? Kind of, no matter where they stand on other general crime issues, understand the importance of rape cases more than they had before, as that information comes out?
I think it has the potential to. Part of what, in fact, Katie and Sondra and I were talking about, and the chief talking about the fact that more education is needed. So now what we have is data. What drives policy? Legislators rely on data to be able to make good decisions and create public policy that really works and that is reasonable. And so I think we have the potential to have more education because of all of the data that's coming through with those rape kits. Now, we can also be very upset, I think, about the fact that it's taken so long, that we have a backlog. That concerns me, that makes me angry, frankly. At the same time, I'm also pragmatic, and I'm happy that we're moving forward, and so the potential to educate is there, but it's something that we have to initiate.
And if we can get one number to stick in their mind, at least at this point, it would be that in Cleveland, at least so far, of the cases that have been indicted where people have been charged, I believe it's, and Joe Froelich sitting in the back, he can give me the nod if it's not still the number, about 45% of these folks that have been indicted are serial rapists. And I think that's just a number that's so large that nobody should be able to ignore it.
And I just wanted to say, in the Lakewood Cleveland case that the chief mentioned before, this individual also was found through the rape kit testing to have sexually assaulted someone years ago. If that isn't proof enough that we need to both get rid of the statute of limitations but also get through and use the resources, I don't know what is.
Thank you. And Katie, just to kind of wrap this up, because I know we're getting a little short on time before our questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about social media and how that has changed the conversation around sexual assault. I know that when I was covering the Steubenville rape case, which involved a rape against a 16-year-old girl, involved some football players in the city of Steubenville, about 2.5 hours south of here. You were there when I covered the trial, and you were very active on social media. And so were all the youth in that city. I mean, it's really how the case came to light. So how do you see that changing the way that we have a conversation about sexual assault, not only around one case, but around the topic in general?
Yeah. I mean, I think over the last 2 years, we've seen so much activism by students on college campuses, groups like Know Your Nine, student advocates, and youth that have really equipped with social media to talk about this issue and to challenge it and to push cases forward that perhaps aren't getting attention. And so even though we hear a lot about Steubenville, what we hear and what rape crisis centers around the state hear every day is that what happened in Steubenville is happening every day across our state. And by really working with youth to equip with skills around bystander intervention so that we're not having that conversation about questioning victim credibility, but it's about holding offenders accountable, and it's about really getting to that root of prevention. So I think it's exciting to see youth engaged in social media and really pushing the envelope and pushing that issue forward.
I think we're ready to take some questions.
I think we're ready to take some questions. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we do that. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club, and today we're enjoying a Friday Forum panel conversation entitled Turning the Tide on Sexual Assault, moderated by Rachel Dissell and featuring State Representative Nickie Antonio from Ohio House District 13, Andres Gonzalez, Chief of Police for the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, Katie Hanna, Executive Director of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Sondra Miller, President and CEO of the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. We encourage all of you here to formulate your questions for our panelists now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. And those of you listening on WCPN may tweet questions at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, November 7th, the City Club hosts another panel conversation, this one on healthcare delivery, the transition from volume to value, For more information about our upcoming programs or any of our past programs, please visit us online at cityclub.org. We welcome guests at tables today hosted by the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, John Carroll University, the Legal Aid Society, Malamed Communications, and the United Way of Greater Cleveland. Thank you so much for your support. We also welcome students from Maple Heights High School and Shaw High School. Student participation was made possible by a generous gift from the Lobb Foundation. We thank you for your support, and we welcome all of you. Our community partner for today's program is the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. We thank you very much for your assistance. And we also would like to thank Philanthropy Ohio, who brought this idea to us in the first place. Now it's time for questions from all of you. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. You don't have to be a member of the City Club to ask a question. Holding our microphones today are our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and our Content Associate, Teddy Eisenberg. Our first question, please.
This is for the panel, and I'm sure you were anticipating something along the college line anyway. Several colleges have adopted policies that require the participants in the sexual act to give ongoing consent at each step of the way. If you had a 20-year-old son in college, would you advise that young man to videotape all his encounters, or how would he protect himself?
It could be illegal. Who would like to take that question?
Well, I would teach my son to respect, so that when he gets into that situation, he doesn't have to carry a video camera or record all of his stuff. You know, I think as I'll keep my law enforcement hat on here. You know, unfortunately, we are in an environment and in a world today where you have to prove what you say and support everything that you're doing by either some kind of recording or videotape. I mean, in our agency, we're looking at equipping our officers with body cameras simply to protect the officer so that they can have a legitimate response, at least be able to validate. So, but I really do go back to, if you teach the child, if you teach the young individual, if you impress upon them the moral responsibility to behave properly and to keep your hands to yourself, and more importantly, no means no, I think at the end of the day, you're going to resolve that problem.
And I would just like to add, being the mother of daughters, that certainly the conversations with our daughters were around respectful, right relationships. And I think more and more college campuses are talking about identifying those and being able to define what that means, including no means no, but yes also means yes. I would not be an advocate for people filming their private encounters whatsoever. I want to be real clear about that. You know, not only is that then leading into some other disrespectful realm, because we've certainly heard about times when people have been filmed unknowingly, and then that's been put all over social media and has destroyed people's lives. So no, I don't think that's the answer. I do agree with the chief. The answer is right relationships and respectful relationships from the beginning.
Title IX has been expanded to include sexual harassment on campuses and sexual assault. My question is, how do you view those regulations and aiding, and could you explain some of those regulations and how they impact your work? Thank you.
And I think that sexual assault on college campuses definitely is a very, very big and growing topic, and I think we'll probably see a lot more about it as the federal government does investigations into different college campuses and how they've handled sexual assaults over the years.
Yes, so we have Title IX that's been around since the 70s, and then we have the Clery Act, which just had what's called the SAVE Act rules that were passed as part of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. And so there's a lot of new guidance and legislation that's coming forward. Certainly on a federal level, there's potential new legislation that could come forward. I think some of the things we really need to pay attention to and make sure that we preserve safe spaces for survivors to talk about what happened and to get the support they need, and make sure they have confidentiality protections. I think one of the issues we balance is that we want to make sure we hold offenders accountable, but at the same time, we do it in a way that really respects survivors' choices around, do they go forward in the criminal justice system? Do they go forward in a campus judicial hearing? And oftentimes we see that survivors will go forward in that process, but making sure that we have rape crisis centers that are partnering with institutions of higher education in our state and across the country, I think that's a way that we can proactively make sure that survivors' rights are upheld, and that we also address issues around preventing it. So there's a lot that's happening around Title IX that is incredibly exciting. I think there's some great guidance that's very clear about how to handle these reports, and a lot that's going to be developing the next year as well.
Good afternoon. First, Rachel, let me just commend you on your recent article about the Imperial Women. It was excellent. And in relating to that, Vanessa Gay, the young lady who was able to escape so well and was not believed by the police, was told by a dispatcher she had to come downtown and file a report, was eventually believed by then Judge Timothy McGinty. She talks about being an addict in the article. And she says something, and I'm not exactly quoting her, but she says, addicts are human, we are not disposable. So my question is really to the chief and to Sondra. In this culture of, addicts being less than, and I'm not saying I feel that way, but that's the way they're treated. Chief, how do you change that culture within your police officers? And Sondra, in the Rape Crisis Center, do you go beyond rape when you get addicts, and do you try to help them get clean, or is that not part of what you do?
Well, my approach to changing culture is twofold. One is policy. I establish clear policy that hopefully will affect the culture of how we are doing things, so that it takes away any biases and any beliefs. And then the second thing is modeling. Just go plain and simple when a report comes in, and as I'm reviewing it and I see that we are improperly questioning the character of an individual just because of what they are telling us, then I have to immediately step up as a leader and address that. I frequently tell my team, a couple people here from my team, how do you turn a big ship? I say very slowly, because if you turn it very quickly, you're going to throw everybody off the ship. But incrementally changes, incremental reinforcements of what is the right thing to do and the correct way to approach somebody, regardless of background, regardless of drug use, regardless of profession. At the end of the day, none of that matters. What matters is that this person, for whatever reason, feels that they have been victimized, and it is our role, it was our job, then to address that victimization and identify the knucklehead responsible for victimizing it. I use that word a lot. Sorry.
And as a Rape Crisis Center, we absolutely have to address addiction and trauma together. We piloted a program probably 10 years ago where we hired a trauma and addiction specialist, because we're working on both of those things at the same time. We're also working very closely with a lot of our partners who are on addiction recovery work and making sure that they are responding to their clients and patients in a very trauma-informed way. We have countless survivors that come to us after they have become sober and saying, but the reason I was using in the first place is because of this trauma that I experienced so very long ago. And it's only until I can get sober that then I can start to focus on the root cause of my pain, which very often is sexual trauma.
Good evening. I am Callista Prather. I am a 10th grader at Shaw High. And my question is, what skills should school teach young people to change minds and attitudes?
You know, thank you so much for that question. There's a couple of programs out there. We talked about a few. There's one that came to my attention recently called WOMAN, and it's young people, leaders in their schools that have taken a pledge to treat their relationships respectfully. So, you know, men and women, young men and women, and they've taken this pledge. And it started off with some leaders in their schools. It's really spread. There's a young woman that's filming the whole thing and making a documentary. It's amazing. To answer your question, I think sometimes there are these discussions about right relationships and respectful relationships that may happen in your school, but I think the ones that stick when information becomes integrated into your life is when students themselves pick up, own it, and then work on creating programs and really educating each other. It's back to being bystanders together, but I think when you own the information and how you want to see those relationships with your other students at school, that's when I think the change really comes.
And Sondra, do you want to talk a little? I think you guys have some programs specific to this that have brought youth in and made them leaders in their schools.
We do, and I want to say as adults, we have to accept that teenagers know more about this issue than we do. Yeah. When we go into schools, when we take our prevention program into school classrooms, students are craving the information. It's the teachers and the administrators and the parents that are like, I don't know about the Rape Crisis Center talking to my teenagers. But the feedback on our forms is consistently, thank you for sharing this. It's about time somebody recognizes what's going on at our parties. And we do all these pre and post tests to measure, are we educating young people? Are we changing their attitudes? And that's all for all the scientists in the room. But there's a question on our evaluation form that I insist that we include, and it's, would you recommend this program to a friend? 99.9% of teenagers say yes. And to me, that's the question that says it all, is that they need this information and they're not getting it from any other places, and this is the only time that we have a safe place to talk about it. So our prevention team has been working for years on a program called Youth 360, and to get very, very much to the heart of the matter is the youth in the program decide what the messages are going to be and how we distribute those messages to other youth, because adults telling teens how to talk about this doesn't work.
Most teens, it seems like, aren't going to come to a parent or a teacher and ask them a question if they are confused about something, but they might go to a friend and say, hey, what do you think about this? And for that friend to have the answer, it's probably a lot better. Yeah.
Hi, I have a two-part question. Thank you for the remarkable work you do every day. My question is, we know that the funding that came for you through the recent budget line item also came with a gag rule that you couldn't counsel or educate about an abortion option. So I'm wondering, Sondra, how you're dealing with that in the Rape Crisis Center. And Representative Antonio, I'm wondering if we can get that out of the budget in the next go-round.
You want to go first? Sure, I'll go first. Everyone's there's a little laughter in the room because you know, I would like nothing more than for that never have been in the bill. And the original bill did not include that gag order, whereby a counselor of rape crisis services, in order to receive those funds, cannot talk about pregnancy termination issues or abortion. So it was, this is an example of how we can't always rely on legislation to be the end-all be-all solution for the problems and issues that we deal with. Because what happens is it's not a perfect science, and unfortunately in this case, politics were embedded into a good policy. And so would I like to see that gag order be removed from that legislation and now it sits on the books in the future? Absolutely. I can't tell you what the possibility of that is in the current legislature to remove that, but certainly it's something that people will you know, work on in the future. But more importantly, I think, is for us to recognize that we have to, and people really raise their voices when these kinds of things happen, where the politics get put into good policy. That's the time for us to really then look at the legislators who are doing those kinds of things and ask yourselves, are these the people that represent what I really believe in?
And I would add to that I think not everyone understands what a rape crisis center does. And I think that maybe some of that misinformation or uninformation informed that policy. What I do know is that we have accepted the funds for slightly over a year, and other than taking an extra step to train our staff and volunteers, it has not impacted the way we deliver services to survivors.
Hello, my name is Brandon Clancy. I'm a senior at Shaw High School. Thank you for allowing us to be here. And my question is, are there any mental or environmental commonalities that go into men that would commit such violent acts? And if so, is there anything that I can do as a bystander to really help change that?
I mean, as a young man, you have incredible influence over the peers that are sitting at your table. And I think simply wearing the pin or wearing the label that says, I care about this issue and all of us are impacted, just saying those words and putting that message out there goes a long way. And then to take it a step further is to be educated about the issue, to understand some of the realities, to teach yourself or push your teachers to provide the information for you. And ultimately, when friends are talking about violence against women as a joke, when we're laughing at it, when we're playing video games where we earn extra points by assaulting somebody, it's to step in and say, hey, this really isn't okay. And this isn't how I as a human, not just as a young man, but how I as a human want to treat other humans. And I hold all of my friends and peers to the same standard.
Environmentally, I would say, you know, we all know that growing up we're subject to peer pressure. And so I would say use reverse peer pressure, or use it to the positive, to everybody, you know, the young people in the room, and just say, reinforce the fact that it's about respecting each other, it's about looking for a healthy relationship, and no means no. And I think that to a person, if we practice that and mentally let that get ingrained into our mind and reinforce that as we're socializing and talking with each other, the message eventually is going to take root, and from there it's just going to grow.
During recent years, there seemed to be an increasing amount of coverage in the media, in newspapers, and radio, and television, of suspected crimes involving sexual assault. Is this increasing number a reality, or does it reflect perhaps the effort of some of the media to capitalize on some of the lurid details of these events?
Yeah, I think we've been very fortunate in Cleveland to have Rachel reporting on this issue. We don't see that there's been an increase in these crimes occurring. We see that it's really been that society's wanted to talk about this issue. And so I think we want to see around the state that we also have reporters covering these issues in a trauma-informed way, making sure that victims are not named in stories, respecting their rights. But I think, you know, it's when we look at things like campus sexual assault too, I think there's this concern sometimes when we see those numbers go up. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily happening more than it always has been. As advocates at rape crisis centers, we've seen this happening every day. It just means that we're at a place in our history where we're talking about this more, and that the media is paying attention to how often this is occurring.
Sure, and I'll step in, you know, for a second. I don't want to give a pass to people that do cover it inappropriately. Clearly, some people pick up a story because they do want those details to hook people in. So I think that those of us that want to be responsible just need to bring the conversation back to the right place. I don't know that it's a great thing that, you know, when sexual assault or domestic violence is linked with football, that we all listen more. But that's the reality we have to deal with. So when that conversation comes up, that's the opportunity to seize on it and have the measured and thoughtful conversation that brings in data and research and people's experiences that do need to be listened to. And you're right, not just cover right when something happens and what those details are, and also understand that when we put those details in stories, if we are too detailed or too graphic, that it could really impact or trigger other survivors. So I think there's been a lot of training for journalists in this state. I know that Katie's done some, and there probably needs to be some more for journalists everywhere on how to appropriately cover these types of cases.
One of the things I'd like to add, maybe not directly to the media coverage, is that, you know, in our region, we really are making significant inroads on collaboration. And part of that is transparency. And so I would say that for everyone in this room, please recognize that at least in our county, if not in our 5-county area, right down from the U.S. Attorney to our county prosecutor to local law enforcement, there is a significant effort underway at collaborating, talking with each other, and more importantly, being transparent. And so perhaps as we become more and more transparent of what's going on, that may allow more information to come out, which may now capture the interest of some of the media individuals. But we should all be aware that in our region here, we really do enjoy the benefit of a lot of cross-collaboration, a lot of conversing, a lot of exchanging of information, and we're really making an attempt from a law enforcement perspective to become transparent with the information that we get.
And I just want to remind us, I guess, that we all have a responsibility as consumers of media, that when there are those times, if it does become inappropriate, that we have a responsibility to respond and let those folks in media know that it's not acceptable. I just watched Anita Hill's documentary, and it reminded me of the graphic nature of that hearing. And 2 things. One was the graphic nature, and 2 was the fact that she wasn't believed. And I'm carrying that with me. And so I think it's really important for us to hold our media folks accountable as well.
I'm Diamond Howard from Maple Heights High School, and I'm a junior. And I wanted to address that there are some comments about women and how they provoke sexual violence by the way they appear or the way they carry themselves. And I want to know your opinion and why you might think they say those things.
Yeah, this is something that these are conversations we have every single day, because survivors come to us looking for help, and yes, they've experienced horrendous trauma, but many times what they are struggling most with is that the people they told shared things like, what did you do to bring it on? Why were you wearing that? Why did you drink? Why? And that is almost what is more hurtful to a survivor than the experience of being assaulted. And we have the luxury at the Rape Crisis Center of believing and supporting every single person who walks through our doors. In the general public, survivors don't have access to that. They don't know who is safe to talk to. They don't know if the law enforcement officer will believe them, or the prosecutor, or their friend, or their teacher, or the so on and so forth. Who's going to blame me for this? And ultimately, I think as a public and as individuals, it's so much easier for me to say, well, she was assaulted because she did that. Because it makes me feel safer, because if I don't do those things, then maybe it won't happen to me. And there's this real misunderstanding at that level that is really what shrouds sexual violence, and this silence that we have in our community makes it hard for all of us to talk about, and then leads us down a road of having policy that's not always informed, or not enough funding and resources to help the people who really need our help.
Where are we in Ohio, if anywhere, on getting or eliminating the statute of limitations for sex offenses?
So there's a couple of bills in the Senate, and we'll continue to to push on them, and Katie may have more information on if we can expect activity, because she's been doing a lot of the advocacy work.
So as we head into the lame duck period, there is one bill that may have a chance of going through, and that's Senate Bill 324. That would be eliminating the statute of limitations on rape when there is DNA. Certainly advocates have been advocating for a full-on elimination of the statute of limitations, because we hear from survivors that could have videotaped evidence. There could be multiple survivors that come forward beyond the 20 years and wanting to make sure that they have that option. They have that right for a case to go through the criminal justice system. So potentially there could be one that would be a step forward, but certainly we are still advocating to see that we eliminate those statute of limitations. I mean, certainly with untested rape kits, we have seen one of the first cases that came down, it was 20 years and 1 day. So 1 day beyond the statute. And so that denies the ability to have justice. And so we need to be able to support our communities by fully addressing this issue.
Katie, what's the main sticking point right now? What's the main debate over the bill that is holding it up?
I think, it's certainly challenging to prosecute cases that have been more than 20 years old. But certainly we respect and know that we want to give everyone the tools that they have to prosecute those crimes. It gives us more tools to be able to seek out justice. And so I still think there's conversations we need to have to move that forward.
And I'll just say that sometimes we have to get halfway. So that DNA bill may be the first step, and then we'll come back and keep working at moving the needle forward.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum panel discussion on turning the tide on sexual assault, featuring State Representative Nickie J. Antonio from Ohio House District 13, Andy Gonzalez, Chief of Police at the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, Katie Hanna, Executive Director of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Sondra Miller, President and CEO of the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. Moderated by the wonderful reporter Rachel Dissell of the Plain Dealer. Thank you, Representative Antonio, Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Hanna, Ms. Miller, Ms. Dissell, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now closed.